President Trump is calling tomorrow Liberation Day as he expands his trade war with new tariffs. Now, it's still not clear which countries will be impacted or when exactly the new levies will go into effect. Still, many Americans worry they will push already high consumer prices even higher.
We are going to be very nice by comparison to what they were. The numbers will be lower than what they've been charging us, and in some cases, maybe substantially lower.
CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand is following all of this for us and joins us from the White House this morning. Natalie, good morning to you. Some of these tariffs remain a mystery, which is quite shocking. What details is the administration sharing?
Good morning, Errol. Yeah, details remain unclear, even though we know that these will be reciprocal tariffs. So in theory, the U.S. will impose duties on countries that impose duties on U.S. exports or products. As you heard the president say there, he says that some of these tariffs will be lower, or he said substantially lower than what other countries charge us. But again, a lot of people waiting for the specifics here. And Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, she was pressed on details yesterday, said she wasn't going to get ahead of the president's announcement. But she did say that his team of trade advisors has been coming up with and presenting plans to the president, and that it will be his decision to make. So we'll have to wait and see what that is tomorrow. But this lack of clarity is making it really difficult for business owners and individuals to plan.
That wait and see, Natalie, is tough for business owners. I was speaking with some friends recently who say inflation is making things difficult, and now they're kind of contending with potentially a customer base that will have less money to spend. What are business owners telling you?
Right. Yeah, I checked in with a longtime restaurateur here in Northern Virginia yesterday, Tony Stafford, who owns a fish restaurant, Ford's Fish Shack. And he told me that right now, around 40% of his seafood comes from Canada. So he's extremely worried about tariffs, about a potential trade war that represents around $1.5 million a year that he spends on buying seafood from outside of the United States. And he's extremely nervous. This comes at a time when restaurant owners, business owners have kind of been struggling in these rocky waters for years now, going back to COVID. He says now with tariffs, he's just not going to be able to absorb that added cost on his own. Take a listen to some of our conversation.
Consumers are going to see price increases. They've already seen price increases, a lot of price increases. You know, it's been 30, 40, 50% over the last 3 years. We're going to see that again, 20, 25, 30% to combat these tariffs, or until we find suitable in the United States producers can produce the same items we're buying outside. We have to pass it along. That's what ways to save labor. We'll be looking at ways to save labor, ways to save maybe even shrinking some hours, some operational hours. You know, I don't really want to get into smaller portions or changing menu items.
So he's kind of looking at all options right now while he tries to figure out the exact impact to his bottom line, what he will have to pass along to customers of his. And, you know, the administration has argued that a goal of theirs is to bring more production back to the United States. He said he will look for U.S.-based suppliers, maybe Maine, for instance, instead of Canada. But he also wonders whether they will be able to keep up with the increased demand. That's one reason he had to look elsewhere, you know, to begin with, Errol.
For more on those tariffs, let's bring in senior White House correspondent Weijia Zhang. Weijia, great to see you this morning. We're having a hard time getting the specifics on this topic that impacts really everyone. So what is known about the tariffs and the expected economic impact?
Well, good morning, Errol. You're right. And economic experts in international trade say that it's highly unusual for an announcement to be coming in 1 or 2 days and not to have any details about which countries are impacted and how much each country will face when it comes to tariffs. And President Trump took several questions about this last night in the Oval Office, and he did not reveal any of that information, even though, of course, reporters pressed him over and over. What he did say was that if you charge us, we're going to charge you. And he said the word reciprocal is very important. But then he went on to say that the U.S. is going to be, quote, a lot nicer than those countries that will face tariffs. He said that the rate will likely be lower, in some cases significantly lower than what those nations tack on to U.S. exports. So it's all very confusing. And this uncertainty is the reason why consumer confidence is taking a tumble, why, various different industries say that they are already seeing prices go up because they want to build a buffer for potentially higher prices that they have to take over. So, Errol, it's all, a big question mark right now. What we do know is, as you mentioned, we are supposed to learn a lot more of these details when the president makes the formal announcement tomorrow here at the White House.
As the world braces for new tariffs that go into effect tomorrow, the relationship between the United States and its closest ally has become strained. Canada's new prime minister had a conversation with President Trump last week and later said there is a lot of work that needs to be done to build back trust. I want to bring in correspondent Mercedes Stephenson from Global TV in Canada to talk more about this. So, Mercedes, how is Canada bracing for these new tariffs?
Well, honestly, Vlad, with a lot of uncertainty because we don't know what they're going to look like. We've heard lots of rumors and innuendo about how much it could be, what products they could be on. We're certainly anticipating it could be on things like dairy here in Canada, which in Canada is essentially a monopoly. You have to get permission from the government to have dairy cows, to have chickens, to have eggs. And that's one of the things that President Donald Trump has been upset about and says that it's an unfair trade practice. So I think there's a couple of things like that we're in particular bracing for. There's questions about what this could look like for the auto sector, for the rest of our agriculture sector, and for Canadian manufacturing. But at this point, we really don't have a sense of how significant those tariffs might be, and therefore how hard Canada might be hit. So the government has a number of plans that they have not unveiled for various circumstances that they're ready to retaliate with. We do know they're planning retaliatory tariffs if Canada's hit, and we're fully expecting that to happen. But what exactly that plan will look like or what cards they're prepared to play, for example, like cutting off energy or putting an export tax on it going to the United States, still remains to be seen.
And also set to go into effect tomorrow, 25% auto tariffs that could increase the price of a new car by $5,000 to $10,000. On that note, CBS News senior White House reporter Jennifer Jacobs, she's tracking all of this for us, and she joins us now. Jennifer, good to see you today. Are we learning anything else about what's to come tomorrow? Because it seems even those in the Trump administration don't exactly know the details about these tariffs.
Well, I think President Trump has a plan in his head, and it will be unveiled tomorrow. We have been trying to figure out what those plans are early so we can let you know, Mugo. But what I can tell you so far is that there are some very large trading partners to the United States that do charge more tariffs on goods that they import from the United States than the United States charges on their goods. And so the White House's strategy here is to try to level the playing field a little bit, to rejigger global trade so that it's more to an advantage for the United States. The president has said he is going to charge these tariffs pretty widely on any country that charges a higher tariff on the United States' goods, but he is saying that he's going to be more generous in some cases than they are on the United States. So it does sound like the president has made up his mind. There has been some finagling behind the scenes from some corners trying to figure out what the tariffs are and maybe negotiate exemptions, but those exemptions are not coming.
And Jennifer, how are countries and also companies reacting to these plans?
You've had some countries who are already saying, our attitude is we're going to do retaliatory tariffs. If the United States increases, we're going to increase. And that includes Canada, leaders in Canada, for example, and the European Union. But you've had other countries, including Vietnam and India, who have said, listen, we're open to doing at least some concessions. Vietnam, for example, said we might be willing to talk about lowering our tariffs on liquefied natural gas and cars and some of the other things that have been bothering the United States. India also reportedly is willing to negotiate, and President Trump mentioned something about that yesterday. So some countries are willing to negotiate, which is what the White House has been hoping for.
And Jennifer, I have to ask you about this because we've seen last-minute rollbacks when it comes to tariffs before. So are we likely to see that again here?
the signals that I'm getting from my administration sources are that these tariffs tomorrow are very real. They do intend for them to stick. It's not some sort of April Fool's edition. The president even said something about that. Like, he didn't want to announce these tariffs on April Fool's Day because he didn't want anyone to be misled. These tariffs are going to stay in place. And it sounds like the idea here is to give the United States some leverage as it negotiates for new trade deals and for lower tariffs.
Okay, CBS News senior White House reporter Jennifer Jacobs, thank you so much for your time today. A live look at how the market is reacting today ahead of that new round of tariffs set to roll out tomorrow. Tariff uncertainty continues to rattle Wall Street, so much so that just yesterday, 2 out of 3 major U.S. stock indexes had their worst quarter since 2022. And back then, the reason for that was because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, just yesterday, CBS News' very own Nancy Cortez asked White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt about the global stock markets, and here's what she had to say. Listen.
And has the global stock market sell-off caused the White House to rethink any of these plans?
The president has always said that the stock market is a snapshot of a moment in time, and he's doing what's best for Main Street, and Wall Street will work out just fine in this administration, just like they did in their first term.
All right, let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. And Kelly, will the uncertainty around these tariffs continue to drag down global markets, you think?
So I think that's a safe bet, especially if it continues to be such a back and forth like we've seen in the past couple of months. So markets hate uncertainty, Mugo, and we have seen the sort of back and forth really make it very difficult for investors to determine what sectors to invest in. It's made it really difficult for companies to determine what to do, what countries to source from. You know, do they move their production to the U.S.? So yes, I think to some extent we are going to see some of that turmoil continue. But what I will highlight is we just finished the first quarter of the year, and I went back and I looked at some of the biggest highs and lows that we had, sort of single day losses in terms of the markets, and they were never on days where there were tariff announcements. In fact, it was when we saw data that was unexpected, like consumer confidence plummeting, inflation coming in higher than expected. So as we see the impacts of these tariff announcements start to make their way through the economic data, that, Mugo, is what I think is going to impact the markets the most. Not necessarily the announcements, the back and forth, but are these tariffs impacting consumers and businesses in the way that many economists fear they will? That, I think, is what will move the markets most.
And on that note, you mentioned inflation, so let's talk about that because Goldman Sachs is already sounding off about inflation. What are they saying?
So let's talk about inflation. They basically did an analysis. They reported over the weekend. I think we might have a chart that we can pull up on this. But they modeled out their expectations for inflation with no tariffs. And what they predicted is that we would find our way to the Federal Reserve's 2% target by the end of this year. Then they modeled with tariffs, sort of with the current thinking on tariffs, which, of course, as we just said, is evolving. And they expect inflation to tick up and reach 3.5% and then hover there for at least a year. So that's kind of the concern that they have with inflation. And of course, then you sort of play that out. What does that mean? You start to see consumers potentially pulling back because they're already worried about higher prices. And then you play that out and they start to spend less. And that sort of leads to a potential slowdown in economic growth, which is something that Goldman also predicted.
And Kelly, 25% auto tariffs also kick in tomorrow. You've talked to auto executives about this. What are they telling you? What are they saying the impact is going to be on them?
Higher prices. So I was actually at an auto dealership yesterday, and I spoke to him. I looked around at the cars on the lot, and I said, which ones of these are going to go up? And he said all of them, because even if they are assembled in the U.S., so many of the key parts come from other places like Canada, Mexico, and China. So there are very few cars, if you will, that are assembled even in America that are immune to these tariffs. Now, what we are also likely going to see from executives that I've been talking to is manufacturing moved to the United States, but that takes time, that takes investment. And I think what I'm hearing from a lot of people is just there's so much uncertainty of how long these things will last, even though the president has said, they are here to stay, that businesses are a little bit in that paralysis phase of what do they do, but they are expecting a pullback from consumers if prices are going to be higher on an auto, which is more in that nice to have versus a need to have when it comes to food and shelter, Mugo.
It's perceived by some that companies or countries, if they change their policies either before tomorrow or after tomorrow, can have the president alter what he's planning for that country or that sector. Is that a possibility? And if so, what factors the president consider in making those changes?
Well, the ultimate change for these companies and these countries, Mark, will happen when they decide to do business in the United States of America. And as I just laid out, they will face no tariffs at all if these companies choose to invest here in the United States and to move their production and their manufacturing here to the United States as well. As for tomorrow, the president will be addressing the decades of unfair trade practices that have ripped our country off and American workers off. It has hollowed out our middle class. It has destroyed our heartland, and the president is focused on reshifting our global economy to ensure that America is once again the manufacturing superpower of the world.
So if they do something today or later in the week that's a pledge for future activity, would that be good enough potentially to alter the policy?
Again, the president has been looking at the very unfair trade practices of the past. Certainly, the president is always up to take a phone call, always up for a good negotiation, but he is very much focused on fixing the wrongs of the past and ensuring that American workers have a fair shake.
So if someone calls after tomorrow and says, hey, I'm ready to make a change, he'd be open to that?
The president is always open to taking calls.
Has the president fully made up his mind on the level of tariffs to impose tomorrow? We keep hearing about a 20% flat rate.
The president said last night he has made a decision and a determination. I was with him in the Oval Office earlier, and he is going to announce that decision tomorrow. I don't want to get ahead of the president. This is obviously a very big day. He's with his trade and tariff team right now, perfecting it to make sure this is a perfect deal for the American people and the American worker, and you will all find out in about 24 hours from now.
And are the car tariffs going to go into effect on April 3rd as scheduled?
Correct. Yes, they will.
When the president goes down to Florida on the weekends, does he ever hear from, there are so many retired folks down in Florida, does he ever hear from any retired Americans who are stressed about these wild swings in the stock market because of the tariff uncertainty, and they're sitting there on fixed income or living off a 401k, and they don't know how much money's going to be left?
Well, certainly they are legitimate concerns, and the president takes those concerns very seriously, and he's addressing them every single day. And tomorrow's announcement is to protect future generations of the senior citizens you mentioned. It's for their kids and their grandkids to ensure that there are jobs here in the United States of America for their children to live the American dream, just like they presumably did. And as for their worries about their 401ks, their Social Security, I just addressed Social Security. This president is always going to protect it for our tax-paying senior citizens. As for their 401ks, look at what President Trump did for you in his first term. He is working on implementing that economic formula every single day by lowering inflation, lowering energy prices, massive deregulatory efforts, while simultaneously effectively implementing tariffs. And they'll hear more about that announcement tomorrow.
And you said that the president right now is with the trade and tariff team. They are very confident that this is all going to work. But
Yes.
what if they're wrong?
They're not going to be wrong. It is going to work. And the president has a brilliant team of advisors who have been studying these issues for decades. And we are focused on restoring the golden age of America and making America a manufacturing superpower. And again, Peter, I would point you to the investments that have already trickled into this country. And the president hasn't even made his tariff announcement yet tomorrow. There have been billions of dollars in private investments from around the world pouring into American communities. What does that look like for those watching at home, for the people you mentioned worried about their own economic circumstances? It means more jobs in your communities, which means more money, more investments, more money in your pocket. That's what the president is committed to. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the president's commitment to tax cuts, which we are counting on Congress to do, especially on Social Security.
One more on the tariffs. Can you say what the latest thinking is on the start date? I know you were just in the Oval.
Are they all going to take effect this week on the reciprocal tariffs? And whenever they start, is that enough time for companies and everyone involved to adjust to that start date?
My understanding is that the tariff announcement will come tomorrow. They will be effective immediately. And the president has been teasing this for quite some time, as you know. He's talked a lot about April 2nd as Liberation Day in America. It would be taking place today if not for April Fool's Day. But tomorrow will be the day, and he's been talking about it for a while. And as a result, you've seen these companies make commitments to investing right here in the United States.
I wonder, back on tariffs, what, if any, market indicators is the White House looking for to see if this tariffs plan is successful down the line?
Well, look, the president has been asked and answered this question about the stock market and whether he's watching it. And I've said, and he has said, the market is a snapshot in time. Yesterday, Dow futures were up. And there's been a lot of talk about the market, and it was up yesterday. So, look, the president wants to ensure that all Americans make out well, particularly Main Street. That's the focus of these tariffs. But as I've said repeatedly, just like they were in his first term, Wall Street will be just fine.
The pause on the Canadian and Mexican tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, that's set to expire tomorrow. Is the president considering extending that pause?
Look, I will let the president speak on the specifics of the tariffs tomorrow. But as for fentanyl, we have seen this has certainly caused a national security crisis here in the United States. Fentanyl continues to be the #1 killer of young people in this country, and the president is very much focused on that.
The president said over the weekend that he couldn't care less if prices went up on foreign cars because people buy more American cars. There's been consensus from a lot of economists that these tariffs could raise prices on other goods as well. Is the president comfortable with Americans on Main Street paying more because of these tariffs?
The president is doing everything he can, and this entire administration is doing everything we can to bring down the cost of living in this country. An inflation mess that was fueled by the previous administration's reckless spending, overburdensome regulations that this administration is focused on slashing every single day. I just read you a statistic just from the Environmental Protective Agency alone. We're saving taxpayers money that's ultimately going to drive down inflation, and we're unleashing the might of our energy industry, which will bring down prices as well. To the heart of your question, because this is very important to the American people, you should trust what this president did for you in his first term. He effectively utilized tariffs while driving down inflation. It was a record low 1.4% when he left office, and he's focused on getting back to that. It's unfortunate the previous administration left us in this mess.
And the president has said foreign countries and companies will eat the cost of tariffs. In his speech on Inauguration Day, he said, quote, "Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens."
Right.
So then why did he have to tell the domestic automakers not to raise prices?
Well, that was a private conversation that was had. I'm not sure if that comment was made or was not made. But as for what the president said in his Inauguration Day speech, he's absolutely correct. A tariff will be a tax on these foreign nations, these foreign companies, and if they want to be absolved of that tariff, then they can come here to the United States of America to do business, bring their jobs here.
So Canadians have been negotiating with the Commerce Secretary over the trade, the tariffs. How many companies are mutually talking with the U.S. or countries are mutually talking with the U.S. to lower tariffs?
I don't have a specific number, but I can tell you there have been quite a few countries that have called the president and have called his team in discussion about these tariffs. But again, there's one country the president cares most about, and it's the United States of America, and doing what's best for the people who elected him to this office to restore their jobs, their wealth, and their prosperity.